The turning point. Dr. Alexander Vaughn, a celebrated cardiac surgeon with a sterling reputation, sat in his expansive, sunlit office on the 20th floor of St. James Medical Center. The office was an extension of the man himself. Elegant, meticulous, and almost unnaturally pristine. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the bustling city skyline, and polished mahogany shelves showcased an array of prestigious awards, plaques, and medical textbooks, their spines unbroken from disuse. A gleaming nameplate on the desk read, Dr. Alexander Vaughn, Chief of Cardiothoracic Surgery. Alexander adjusted his bespoke silk tie, his sharp blue eyes scanning a chart on his tablet. The governor's surgery was scheduled for that afternoon, a triple bypass procedure that had drawn the attention of local media outlets. The operation was high-profile, high-pressure, and the perfect opportunity to further cement his place as the hospital's crown jewel. The buzz of the intercom disrupted his focus. Dr. Vaughn, this is reception. There's an urgent case downstairs. Alexander frowned and pressed the intercom button. I made it clear I am not to be disturbed this morning. I understand, sir, but it's a child. A young girl. She's in critical condition. A sigh escaped him, sharp and impatient. Send her to the ER. Sir, the receptionist's voice lowered, hesitant. The mother specifically requested to see you. She says it's a matter of life or death. Alexander's irritation flared. He glanced at his assistant, Claire, who stood by the door with her tablet, waiting to review the pre-op checklist. She gave him a subtle shrug, silently advising him to brush it off. Tell her I'm unavailable, he said curtly and disconnected the call. Moments later, Claire's phone buzzed. She answered, her face tightening. Dr. Vaughn, security says the woman refuses to leave the waiting area. Alexander pinched the bridge of his nose. I'll handle it. Rising from his chair, he strode toward the door, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. The scene in the waiting room was a stark contrast to the sterile luxury of Alexander's office. A woman in threadbare clothes clutched a young girl against her chest. The child, no older than 10, was limp in her arms, her face pale and her breathing shallow. Her lips bore an alarming blue tint, and every labored breath sounded like a struggle against an unseen force. Please, the woman begged, her voice raw with desperation. Dr. Vaughn, she's dying. You have to help her. Alexander's eyes flicked over the girl, noting the signs of advanced cardiopulmonary distress. Without a doubt, her condition was dire. But as his gaze shifted to the woman, he registered something else. The wear and tear of poverty. Her clothes were faded, her shoes scuffed. She had none of the polish or privilege of his usual clientele. Do you have insurance? He asked, his tone devoid of warmth. The woman hesitated, her voice breaking. No, but I'll find a way to pay. Please, she doesn't have much time. This is a private facility, Alexander replied, folding his arms across his chest. We don't accept walk-ins without insurance. Take her to County General. They handle cases like this. She won't make it. The woman's voice cracked, her grip tightening on the girl. Tears streaked her face as she tried again, her hand reaching toward Alexander. Please, I'm begging you. Alexander stepped back, his expression stiffening. If you don't leave, I'll have security escort you out. The woman's face crumpled, despair radiating from her trembling frame. You took an oath to help people, she whispered. Alexander's jaw tightened. I took an oath to use my skills wisely. This hospital has policies in place for a reason. As if on cue, 2 security guards stepped forward. They hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but ultimately obeyed Alexander's unspoken command. The woman clung to her daughter, sobbing as they ushered her toward the exit. Back in his office, Alexander pushed the incident from his mind. He focused instead on the upcoming surgery. The media buzzed with excitement as reporters set up outside the hospital, their cameras trained on the main entrance. Hours later, the governor's surgery was deemed a resounding success. Alexander fielded questions from journalists with his trademark poise, his answers carefully crafted to emphasize his expertise. The incident in the waiting room was already a distant memory. That evening, Alexander returned home to his lavish penthouse apartment. He poured himself a glass of scotch and settled into a leather armchair, relishing the silence. But as he stared out at the city lights, a nagging unease crept into his mind. The child's face, the way her chest heaved with each labored breath, flashed before his eyes. He shook his head. It wasn't his fault. The woman had options. County General was equipped for emergencies. And besides, he couldn't save everyone. Still, sleep eluded him that night. The next morning, as Alexander walked into the hospital, Claire intercepted him with an urgent expression. "Dr. Vaughn, you need to see this." She handed him a tablet. On the screen was a news article. The headline read, "Local child dies after being denied care at prestigious clinic." Below it was a photograph of the girl, smiling brightly in what appeared to be a school picture. Alexander's stomach dropped. He read on, each word hitting him like a blow. Kayla Davis, age 10, died en route to County General Hospital after being refused treatment at St. James Medical Center. Her mother, Denise Davis, claims that Dr. Alexander Vaughn turned them away despite Kayla's obvious distress. The article included a quote from Denise. "I begged him to help my daughter, and he refused. If she had been treated sooner, she might still be alive." Alexander's hands trembled. He glanced at Claire, who was watching him cautiously. "It's bad, isn't it?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Claire nodded. "It's spreading like wildfire. Social media's picked it up. People are calling for your resignation." Alexander spent the day dodging calls from reporters and board members. His email inbox overflowed with messages, many of them angry and accusatory. By evening, his pristine reputation, a reputation he'd spent decades building, was in shambles. And then the final blow came. A knock at his office door revealed a tall, imposing man with a familiar face. Denise stood behind him, her expression cold and resolute. The man stepped forward, his voice low and filled with quiet menace. "I'm Marcus Davis," he said, "Kayla's father." Alexander's breath caught in his throat. He knew the name. Everyone did. Marcus Davis wasn't just any man. He was a powerful civil rights attorney with a reputation for tearing down systemic injustices. And now his fury was directed squarely at Alexander Vaughn. The storm unleashed. Dr. Alexander Vaughn sat frozen in his chair, staring up at Marcus Davis, whose presence dominated the room. Marcus was tall, broad-shouldered, and impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that exuded quiet power. But it was his eyes, piercing, dark, and brimming with restrained fury, that unsettled Alexander the most. Behind him, Denise Davis stood with her arms crossed, her face set in a mask of sorrow and determination. She refused to look directly at Alexander, her gaze fixed instead on the photo of him shaking hands with a state senator prominently displayed on the wall. Alexander finally managed to find his voice. "Mr. Davis, I'm deeply—" "Don't." Marcus interrupted, his tone clipped. "Don't you dare offer me empty apologies." Alexander closed his mouth, unsure of how to proceed. His carefully constructed world, built on accolades, precision, and control, seemed to be crumbling before his eyes. "You turned my daughter away," Marcus continued, his voice low but laced with barely contained rage. "You looked at her, looked at Denise, and decided they weren't worth your time. And now my little girl is dead." The word struck Alexander like a physical blow. He opened his mouth to protest, to explain the policies, the lack of insurance, the overwhelming demands on his time. But none of it sounded reasonable, even to him. "Do you have children, Dr. Vaughn?" Marcus asked suddenly, his tone deceptively calm. Alexander hesitated. "No," he admitted. Marcus nodded, as though that confirmed something he'd suspected. "Then you can't possibly understand. You don't know what it's like to hold your child in your arms as she takes her last breath. knowing someone had the power to save her and chose not to. Denise spoke then, her voice shaking but resolute. You didn't even listen. You didn't ask questions. You saw us, and you made up your mind. How many others like us have you turned away? Alexander wanted to defend himself, to point out the countless lives he had saved, the patients he had fought for. But as he looked at the grieving parents before him, he realized that those victories meant nothing to them. They only knew the pain of losing their daughter, a pain he had played a part in. I'm sorry, he said finally, the words feeling hollow even as he spoke them. Sorry won't bring Kayla back, Marcus snapped. He placed a thick folder on Alexander's desk. But this might ensure you never do this to anyone else. Alexander stared at the folder, his stomach sinking. What is this? Evidence, Marcus said coldly. A detailed account of every patient you've turned away in the past 5 years. Names, dates, outcomes. Some didn't survive the delay in treatment, all because of your so-called policies. How did you? Alexander began, but Marcus cut him off. I have resources, he said simply, and a lot of people who owe me favors. This, he gestured to the folder, is only the beginning. I've already sent copies to the press, the hospital board, and a few choice advocacy groups. Alexander's chest tightened. You're trying to ruin me. Marcus leaned forward, his hands braced on the desk. No, Dr. Vaughn. You ruined yourself. I'm just making sure everyone knows who you really are. The fallout was immediate and devastating. By the end of the week, the story had gone national. Headlines screamed accusations of negligence, racism, and elitism. News outlets dug into Alexander's past, unearthing instances where he had allegedly dismissed low-income patients or refused to perform surgeries for patients without insurance. Protesters gathered outside St. James Medical Center, holding signs with slogans like "Healthcare is a right" and "Justice for Kayla." The once pristine hospital now bore the scars of outrage, graffiti on its walls, shattered windows, and a constant din of chanting. Inside, Alexander faced the wrath of the hospital board. The chairman, an elderly man with a perpetually furrowed brow, spoke gravely during the emergency meeting. Dr. Vaughn, your actions, or rather, your inaction, have put this institution's reputation at risk. We've received threats of lawsuits, and several major donors have already withdrawn their support. Alexander sat stiffly in his chair, his hands folded in his lap. I understand, but nothing. The chairman interrupted. You've left us no choice. Effective immediately, you are suspended from all clinical duties pending a full investigation. Suspended. The word reverberated in Alexander's mind. For the first time in his career, he had been stripped of his power, his authority, and his identity. In the days that followed, Alexander became a pariah. Former colleagues avoided him in the hallways, their once respectful greetings replaced by cold silence. Patients canceled appointments, unwilling to be associated with the doctor whose name had become synonymous with indifference and prejudice. At home, Alexander found no respite. His phone rang incessantly with calls from reporters, lawyers, and former allies distancing themselves from the scandal. His social media accounts were flooded with vitriol, and his name trended daily under hashtags like #JusticeForKayla and #VaughnExposed. Unable to bear the isolation, Alexander turned to the one place he had always sought solace, his work. But the hospital was no longer a sanctuary. His access to patient files was revoked, and his office had been reassigned. The only reminder of his presence was the plaque on the wall commemorating his years of service, now an ironic monument to his fall from grace. One evening, as he paced his empty penthouse, Alexander's thoughts turned to Marcus Davis. Despite his anger, he couldn't deny a grudging respect for the man's tenacity. Marcus had turned his pain into a weapon, wielding it with precision to dismantle Alexander's carefully constructed life. Unable to stop himself, Alexander searched Marcus's name online. The results were staggering. a litany of high-profile cases where Marcus had fought for victims of discrimination, corruption, and injustice. He had taken on corporate giants, government agencies, and even law enforcement, often emerging victorious. For the first time, Alexander began to understand the depth of his opponent's resolve. Marcus wasn't just seeking retribution for his daughter. He was fighting to change a system that had failed countless others like her. A week later, Alexander received an unexpected visitor. Claire, his former assistant, stood on his doorstep, clutching a folder. "I shouldn't be here," she said, stepping inside. "But you need to see this." Inside the folder were documents detailing cases similar to Kayla's, patients who had been turned away or whose care had been delayed. But there was one crucial difference. Many of these cases predated Alexander's tenure as chief of cardiothoracic surgery. "This isn't just about you," Claire said quietly. "The hospital has been doing this for years, denying care to patients who can't pay, prioritizing wealthy donors over those who actually need help." Alexander's hands trembled as he flipped through the pages. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because you need to decide what kind of man you want to be," Claire said. "You can fight to clear your name, or you can fight to change the system." Her words lingered long after she left. That night, Alexander stared out at the city, his mind racing. For the first time, he saw his role in a larger, more insidious problem. It wasn't just about Kayla or Marcus or even himself. It was about a system that prioritized profit over humanity, a system he had upheld and benefited from. And for the first time in his life, Alexander felt the stirrings of something he hadn't experienced in years: purpose. The road to redemption. The following days were a crucible of reflection for Dr. Alexander Vaughn. Stripped of his title, reputation, and sense of purpose, he had been forced to confront a stark truth. The world he had built his life around was a house of cards, one that had crumbled under the weight of its own hypocrisy. Yet, amidst the rubble of his career, a flicker of determination emerged. He couldn't undo the harm he had caused, but perhaps, just perhaps, he could do something meaningful to honor the life he had failed to save. The first step in his transformation came with a phone call. Sitting at his kitchen table late one night, the city lights twinkling outside the window, Alexander hesitated before dialing the number Claire had provided. It rang twice before a deep, familiar voice answered. "This is Marcus Davis." There was a long pause. "Mr. Davis," Alexander began, his voice shaky. "This is Dr. Alexander Vaughn." Another pause, heavier this time. "Why are you calling me?" Marcus's voice was sharp, distrustful. I want to help," Alexander said. "I know it's too late for Kayla, but Claire showed me the documents. The hospital's policies, the systemic negligence. I see it now. I can't change what happened, but I want to make things right." Marcus let out a bitter laugh. "And why should I believe you? The man who couldn't be bothered to save my daughter now wants to play hero." "You shouldn't believe me," Alexander admitted. "I don't deserve your trust. But this isn't about me. It's about all the other children who won't get the care they need because the system is broken. You've been fighting this battle your whole life. I want to join you." There was silence on the other end of the line. Finally, Marcus spoke. "If you're serious, meet me tomorrow. Noon. My office." The next day, Alexander arrived at Marcus's downtown office, a modest space lined with bookshelves overflowing with legal texts. The walls were adorned with photos of civil rights marches, newspaper clippings of landmark cases, and a framed portrait of Kayla that hung prominently behind Marcus's desk. Marcus greeted him with a nod, his expression guarded. Denise sat in a chair by the window, her face unreadable. "Let's get one thing straight," Marcus said as Alexander sat down across from him. "This isn't about forgiveness. I don't forgive you. Denise doesn't forgive you, and I'm not sure I ever will." Alexander nodded, his gaze steady. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, just a chance to make a difference." Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying him. "You say you want to help. What exactly do you bring to the table?" For the first time in days, Alexander felt a flicker of confidence. Expertise, connections, and insider's knowledge of how the healthcare system works and how it doesn't. I can expose what's been hidden and help build something better. Marcus exchanged a glance with Denise, who gave a small nod. All right, Dr. Vaughn. Let's see if you're as serious as you claim. The next few weeks were grueling. Marcus put Alexander to work immediately, assigning him to review stacks of case files, each one detailing instances of medical neglect or denial of care. The stories were harrowing. A diabetic teenager turned away from a clinic because her parents couldn't afford insulin. A construction worker who lost his leg after a delay in treatment for an infection. A single mother who died from undiagnosed cancer after being dismissed by multiple doctors. Each file was a reminder of the lives lost or irrevocably damaged by a system Alexander had once championed. The weight of it was overwhelming, but it also fueled his resolve. As the weeks turned into months, Alexander became an integral part of Marcus's team. He worked late nights drafting reports, analyzing hospital policies, and preparing testimonies for hearings. His knowledge of medical practices and hospital operations proved invaluable in uncovering systemic flaws and holding institutions accountable. One of their first major victories came when they uncovered evidence of financial incentives that encouraged private hospitals to prioritize wealthy, insured patients over those in critical need. The revelation sparked a public outcry, leading to the resignation of several hospital executives and the implementation of new policies aimed at improving access to care. For the first time in years, Alexander felt a sense of purpose that went beyond personal ambition. Despite his progress, Alexander knew that earning Marcus's trust would be an uphill battle. Their relationship remained strained, their conversations strictly professional. But one evening, after a particularly grueling day, Denise approached him as he was packing up his things. "Why are you really doing this?" she asked, her tone skeptical. Alexander paused, the question catching him off guard. "Because I have to," he said finally. "Because if I don't, then Kayla's death was for nothing. And I couldn't live with that." Denise studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Keep proving it." The turning point came 6 months later, during a high-stakes press conference. Marcus and Alexander stood side by side as they unveiled their findings from a year-long investigation into healthcare inequality. The room was packed with journalists, activists, and community leaders. Alexander stepped up to the podium, his palms sweating. He took a deep breath and began. "Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Alexander Vaughn. For years, I was part of a system that prioritized profit over people, that turned away those in need simply because they couldn't pay. I was complicit in that system, and I failed to see the harm it caused, until it was too late." He glanced at Marcus, who gave a small nod. "I'm here today not to absolve myself, but to take responsibility and to advocate for change. This isn't just about one hospital or one doctor. It's about a system that has failed us all. And it's time to rebuild it." The room erupted in applause. For the first time, Alexander felt something close to redemption. In the months that followed, Alexander and Marcus' partnership continued to grow. They launched initiatives to provide free medical care to underserved communities, lobbied for legislative reforms, and worked to dismantle the barriers that had kept so many from accessing the care they needed. Though the pain of losing Kayla would never fade, her memory became a driving force behind their efforts. Her portrait hung in every clinic they opened, a reminder of the little girl who had sparked a revolution. One evening, as they were leaving a community event, Marcus turned to Alexander. "You've come a long way, Dr. Vaughn," he said quietly, "but this fight is far from over." Alexander nodded. "I know, and I'm ready." For the first time, Marcus offered a small smile. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet, but it was a start. And for Alexander, it was enough. The fight deepens. Alexander Vaughn stood at the podium in a packed community center, addressing a crowd of healthcare workers, activists, and everyday citizens. The murmurs of the audience quieted as he spoke, his voice steady and resolute. "We're here today because the system has failed us. Failed all of us," he began. "It's not just the uninsured or the underprivileged. It's anyone who has ever faced denial, delay, or judgment when they needed care the most." The audience nodded, their faces a mix of anger, hope, and determination. Among them, Marcus and Denise Davis sat in the front row, watching Alexander with measured expressions. Though they still bore the weight of their grief, their presence signaled a growing trust in Alexander's transformation. "The time for silence is over," Alexander continued. "We've exposed the cracks in the system. Now, it's time to rebuild." The crowd erupted in applause, a standing ovation rising like a wave. For a fleeting moment, Alexander allowed himself to feel proud, not for himself, but for the movement he had become part of. A movement born from tragedy, but fueled by hope. The months that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Alexander and Marcus became a formidable team, blending Marcus's legal expertise with Alexander's medical insights. Together, they formed the Kayla Davis Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to fighting healthcare inequality. The foundation launched several initiatives. Community clinics. They opened free clinics in underserved neighborhoods, staffed by volunteer medical professionals. These clinics became lifelines for families who had previously been unable to access basic care. Legislative advocacy. Marcus spearheaded efforts to lobby for policy changes, while Alexander testified before state and federal committees, sharing firsthand accounts of systemic failures. Public awareness campaigns. Denise took the lead in organizing events and rallies, ensuring that Kayla's story, and the stories of countless others, remained at the forefront of public consciousness. Through these efforts, the foundation gained national recognition, drawing support from celebrities, politicians, and grassroots activists. But with success came new challenges. One of the most daunting obstacles emerged when the foundation took on the case of Johnson v. St. James Medical Center, a class action lawsuit representing dozens of families who had been denied care at the hospital. The case aimed not only to secure justice for the victims, but also to set a precedent that would force other institutions to change their practices. The legal battle was fierce. St. James's attorneys, backed by a formidable corporate machine, attacked the plaintiffs with ruthless efficiency. They argued that the hospital had acted within its rights, citing policies and procedures designed to ensure the sustainability of the institution. "They're trying to bury us in paperwork," Marcus said one evening, slamming a thick stack of legal documents onto the conference table. "They think if they drag this out long enough, we'll run out of money and resources. We won't," Alexander said firmly. "We can't." But the strain of the fight was palpable. Long nights in the office became the norm, with Marcus poring over legal briefs, Denise coordinating media outreach, and Alexander working tirelessly to gather evidence and expert testimonies. As the trial date approached, Alexander found himself grappling with his own guilt. He had once been a willing participant in the very system he was now fighting against. Though he had made strides to atone for his actions, the weight of his past lingered. One evening, as he worked late at the foundation's office, Marcus joined him. For a moment, the two men sat in silence, the only sound the faint hum of the city outside. "You've changed," Marcus said finally, breaking the silence. Alexander looked up, startled. "I hope so." Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying him. "You've done good work, Vaughn. But you need to understand something. This fight, it's not about you. It's about Kayla. It's about every family who's been failed by this system." "I know," Alexander said quietly. "That's why I'm here." Marcus nodded, his expression softening. "Then let's win this." The trial was a spectacle. Journalists packed the courtroom, eager to cover the high-stakes battle. Families of the plaintiffs filled the gallery, their presence a powerful reminder of what was at stake. Alexander took the stand on the third day, his testimony a pivotal moment in the case. Under Marcus's questioning, He detailed the hospital's discriminatory practices, exposing the financial incentives that prioritized profit over patient care. "Dr. Vaughn," Marcus said, pacing the courtroom, "in your professional opinion, could these practices have been avoided?" "Yes," Alexander said firmly. "Absolutely. Hospitals have a moral and ethical obligation to provide care to those in need, regardless of their ability to pay. What happened at St. James wasn't just negligence, it was a choice." The defense attorney pounced during cross-examination, attempting to discredit Alexander by highlighting his past actions. "Dr. Vaughn, isn't it true that you personally turned away patients who couldn't pay?" Alexander's stomach clenched, but he met the attorney's gaze. "Yes, and I will regret those decisions for the rest of my life. But that's exactly why I'm here, to ensure no one else suffers because of policies I once upheld." His words hung heavy in the air, resonating with the jury. The trial dragged on for weeks, each day bringing new revelations and challenges. But slowly the tide began to turn. Marcus's team presented damning evidence of systemic failures, while the testimonies of grieving families painted a heartbreaking picture of lives lost and shattered. On the final day of the trial, Marcus delivered a closing argument that brought the courtroom to tears. "This case isn't just about one hospital or one doctor," he said, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "It's about a system that has put profit above people for far too long. It's about a little girl named Kayla, who could have been saved if someone had cared enough to see her as more than a statistic. Today, we have the chance to say, no more. No more children left to die. No more families destroyed by preventable loss. It's time for change." The verdict came 3 days later. The jury ruled in favor of the plaintiffs, awarding substantial damages and ordering sweeping reforms at St. James Medical Center. The ruling was hailed as a landmark victory, a turning point in the fight for healthcare equity. Outside the courthouse, Alexander stood with Marcus and Denise as a crowd of supporters cheered. For the first time, he felt a sense of closure, not for himself, but for Kayla. "She would have been proud of you," Denise said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. Alexander swallowed hard, unable to speak. Instead, he nodded, the weight of her words settling over him like a benediction. But the fight was far from over. As Marcus had warned, this victory was only one battle in a much larger war. Yet for the first time, Alexander felt ready to face whatever came next. Because now, he wasn't just a doctor. He was an advocate, a fighter, a man determined to honor the memory of a little girl who had changed his life forever. The battle expands. The Kayla Davis Foundation's victory in court was monumental, but Alexander Vaughn and Marcus Davis knew it was only the beginning. The media coverage, the cheering crowds, and the symbolic reforms at St. James Medical Center were all milestones. But they weren't enough. Healthcare inequality was a hydra, with countless heads to cut off. Marcus addressed their team during a late-night strategy meeting. The room was small and packed with activists, lawyers, and medical professionals. Maps and data charts lined the walls, alongside a prominently displayed photo of Kayla. "We've shaken the system," Marcus began, his voice steady and commanding. "But a single verdict isn't systemic change. It's a ripple, and we need to turn it into a wave." Alexander sat near the end of the table, his notebook filled with ideas. "We need to focus on rural areas," he said, looking up. "Urban centers get the attention, but out there, people are dying without even knowing their conditions are treatable." Denise, seated beside Marcus, nodded. "And we can't forget about education. Families don't just need access to care. They need to know how to navigate the system, how to advocate for themselves." Marcus leaned forward, his hands steepled. "Then it's settled. Our next step is a national campaign. Advocacy, outreach, and building more clinics. We'll call it Kayla's Legacy." The campaign begins. The next few months were a whirlwind of activity. The foundation partnered with local organizations across the country, organizing town halls, mobile clinics, and advocacy workshops. Alexander found himself traveling to places he had never imagined visiting. Tiny Appalachian towns, sprawling Native American reservations, and impoverished inner-city neighborhoods. At first, he was met with skepticism. His polished demeanor and history as a former elite doctor made him an outsider. But as he rolled up his sleeves and got to work, examining patients, listening to their stories, and advocating for their needs, he began to earn their trust. One such moment came in a remote Mississippi town, where Alexander volunteered at a free clinic. A middle-aged man named Thomas walked in, his gait unsteady and his face etched with pain. He hesitated when he saw Alexander's white coat. "I don't got insurance," Thomas mumbled, clutching his side. Alexander met his eyes. "You don't need insurance here," he said gently. "Let's see how we can help." After a brief examination, Alexander diagnosed Thomas with a hernia that had gone untreated for years. He arranged for surgery at a nearby hospital, personally covering the cost through the foundation. "Why are you doing this?" Thomas asked as Alexander walked him out. "Doctors like you don't usually care about folks like me." Alexander paused, his expression somber. "Because I've been the kind of doctor who didn't care. And I'll regret that for the rest of my life. But I'm trying to do better now." Opposition rises. Not everyone welcomed the foundation's efforts. Healthcare executives, lobbyists, and politicians with ties to the industry began pushing back. They accused the foundation of being disruptive, radical, and anti-business. One night, as Alexander prepared for bed in a motel room after a long day at a mobile clinic, his phone buzzed. It was Marcus. "They're coming for us," Marcus said, his voice tight with frustration. "The insurance companies are funding attack ads, painting us as reckless idealists who don't understand economics." Alexander sighed. "Let them. We'll counter with the truth." The ads hit hard. They aired slick commercials featuring well-dressed spokespeople warning of the dangers of universal access to care. Words like unsustainable and socialized medicine flashed across the screen, designed to stoke fear. But Marcus, Denise, and Alexander were ready. They launched a counter-campaign featuring real stories of lives saved and families transformed by the foundation's work. They leaned heavily on Kayla's story, using her face and her legacy as a symbol of what the fight was about. The public's response was overwhelming. Donations poured in, volunteers signed up in droves, and social media exploded with hashtags like #KaylaSLegacy and #HealthCareForAll. The turning point. Despite the growing momentum, the team faced a major setback when one of their newly opened clinics was vandalized. Windows were shattered, equipment was destroyed, and graffiti scrawled across the walls read, "Stay in your lane." The incident shook the team, especially Alexander. "They're trying to intimidate us," he said during an emergency meeting, "to make us back down." Marcus's jaw tightened. "Then we push harder. We file charges, rebuild, and make it clear we're not going anywhere." But the attack also served as a reminder of the personal risks involved. One evening, Alexander returned to his apartment to find a threatening letter slipped under his door. It read simply, "You can't save everyone. Stop trying." He called Marcus, his voice tense. "We need to be careful. They're getting desperate." Marcus's reply was steady. "Desperate people make mistakes. Stay the course." A personal reckoning. As the foundation expanded, Alexander began to reconnect with his own past. His transformation had brought him closer to people and stories he had once overlooked, and it forced him to reflect on the life he had lived before. One day, he visited his childhood home for the first time in decades. The modest suburban house had been sold after his parents passed, but standing there, Alexander was flooded with memories of his mother's sacrifices to pay for his education and his father's insistence that he aim higher than the rest. He realized that his drive for success had always been fueled by a fear of failure. In pursuing prestige, he had lost sight of the values his parents had tried to instill in him: compassion, humility, and service. That evening, he wrote a letter to Kayla, a letter he knew she would never read. In it, he poured out his regrets, his hopes, and his promise to honor her memory by dedicating the rest of his life to this fight. Building a movement. By the end of the year, Kayla's legacy had become more than a campaign. It was a movement. The foundation had opened 15 new clinics, passed legislation in 2 states mandating free emergency care for uninsured patients, and inspired countless other organizations to take up the cause. One of their proudest moments came during the grand opening of a state-of-the-art community health center in New York City. The building's facade bore a mural of Kayla, her radiant smile a beacon of hope. As Alexander addressed the crowd, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Kayla's legacy isn't just about what we've built, he said. It's about the lives we'll save and the future we'll create together. Marcus stood beside him, his hand resting on Denise's shoulder. For the first time, he looked at Alexander not with distrust, but with a quiet respect. The fight wasn't over. There were still battles to be fought, systems to dismantle, and lives to save. But in that moment, standing beneath Kayla's mural, Alexander knew they were on the right path. The legacy lives on. The chill of a crisp autumn morning filled the air as a large crowd gathered in front of a towering, newly built facility in Chicago's South Side. The building, named the Kayla Davis Memorial Health Center, stood as a testament to resilience and the power of collective action. It was the largest project yet undertaken by the Kayla Davis Foundation, and its opening was a momentous occasion. The crowd included local families, healthcare workers, activists, and members of the media. Among them were Alexander Vaughn, Marcus Davis, and Denise Davis, standing together at the forefront. For the first time in years, Alexander felt a semblance of peace. He had finally begun to understand that redemption wasn't a destination. It was a journey, one he was committed to for the rest of his life. The grand opening. Alexander stepped up to the microphone as applause rippled through the crowd. He adjusted his tie, the nerves that once plagued him now replaced with a calm conviction. "Good morning, everyone," he began, his voice steady and clear. "Today, we're not just opening a building. We're opening a future where no one has to fear being turned away from care. A future where every life, every child, is treated as priceless." He paused, looking out at the crowd. "This center is more than bricks and mortar. It's a promise that Kayla Davis's story will never be forgotten. A promise that her life, though tragically cut short, will inspire countless others to live longer, healthier lives." Applause swelled again, and Alexander stepped back, allowing Marcus to take the stage. Marcus's voice carried the weight of a father's grief and the fire of an advocate. "Kayla was my daughter, but today her legacy belongs to all of us. This fight started with her, but it's about so much more. It's about ensuring that every family, every child, has access to the care they deserve. And I promise you this, we won't stop until that vision is a reality." As Marcus finished, Denise approached the podium, holding a framed photograph of Kayla. Her voice trembled, but her resolve was unshakable. "This is Kayla," she said, lifting the photo for the crowd to see. "She loved to dance, to sing, to dream about a future where she could do anything. We couldn't save her, but because of her, we can save others. This center is proof that even in our darkest moments, we can find light." Challenges on the horizon. Despite the triumph of the new health center, the foundation's work continued to face obstacles. While public support for healthcare reform had grown, so had the resistance from powerful entities determined to protect the status quo. Insurance companies, hospital conglomerates, and pharmaceutical giants worked tirelessly to undermine the foundation's efforts. One of the most significant challenges came in the form of a proposed bill in Congress, heavily lobbied by corporate interests, that aimed to roll back key healthcare protections. The bill threatened to undo much of the progress made by the foundation, putting the lives of millions at risk. "We can't let this happen," Marcus said during an emergency strategy meeting. "If this bill passes, it'll gut everything we fought for." Alexander nodded. "We need to mobilize. Rallies, petitions, media campaigns, whatever it takes to stop this. Denise chimed in, her voice steady. And we need to share the stories of those who will be affected. Real people, real lives. Let's make it impossible for them to ignore. A nationwide movement. The Foundation's response was swift and powerful. They organized town halls across the country, bringing together patients, doctors, and advocates to share their experiences. Alexander traveled tirelessly, speaking at events and appearing on news programs to highlight the devastating impact the bill would have. At one rally in Washington, D.C., Alexander found himself face to face with a young girl named Amina. She was 12 years old, the same age Kayla had been, and she reminded him so much of her. Amina was living with a congenital heart condition, and her mother had fought tirelessly to get her the care she needed. "Dr. Vaughn," Amina said, her voice soft but steady, "do you think people will listen to us?" Alexander knelt down to her level, looking into her wide, hopeful eyes. "They will," he promised, "because you have a story that needs to be heard, and I'll make sure they hear it." Amina's story, along with dozens of others, became the heart of the Foundation's campaign against the bill. Social media lit up with hashtags like #HearOurStories and #KaylaSligusOurLives, sparking a groundswell of support. A pivotal victory. After months of relentless advocacy, the day of the vote arrived. The Capitol was packed with protesters, many holding signs with Kayla's face or wearing shirts emblazoned with the Foundation's logo. Inside, the tension was palpable as lawmakers debated the bill. Alexander, Marcus, and Denise watched from the gallery, their hands tightly clasped. The hours dragged on, every speech and vote feeling like a lifetime. Finally, the results were announced. The bill had been defeated by a narrow margin. The gallery erupted in cheers, and Alexander felt a wave of relief and pride. But as he looked at Marcus and Denise, he saw something deeper, a shared understanding that the fight was far from over. "This is just one victory," Marcus said as they stepped outside into the jubilant crowd. "We've got a long way to go." Alexander nodded, "But it's a step in the right direction." The path forward. In the years that followed, the Foundation continued to grow, its influence spreading across the country and beyond. Alexander became a leading voice in the fight for healthcare reform, his past mistakes fueling his determination to create a better future. He often thought of Kayla, her smile, her spirit, and the profound impact she had on his life. Every clinic opened, every law changed, every life saved was a tribute to her. One evening, after a long day of work, Alexander visited the original clinic they had opened in Kayla's name. It was quiet, the waiting room empty as the staff prepared to close for the night. He walked through the halls, his footsteps echoing softly. In the main lobby, he stopped in front of Kayla's portrait. Beneath it was a plaque that read, "In loving memory of Kayla Davis, whose light continues to guide us." He touched the edge of the frame, his throat tightening. "Thank you," he whispered, "for teaching me what it means to truly care." As he left the clinic, the city lights sparkled in the distance, a reminder that the world was still full of challenges, but also of hope. Kayla's legacy was alive, and as long as it was, Alexander knew he would never stop fighting. A legacy eternal. Years later, the world had transformed in ways few could have imagined. The seeds planted by the Kayla Davis Foundation had blossomed into a movement that reshaped healthcare systems across the United States. Clinics bearing Kayla's name stood in neighborhoods once forgotten. Legislative victories had safeguarded access to care, and the public's perception of healthcare as a right rather than a privilege had gained momentum. Dr. Alexander Vaughn, now a revered figure in the movement, stood on the stage at the National Advocacy Summit in Washington, D.C. The room was filled with healthcare workers, activists, legislators, and families whose lives had been touched by the Foundation's work. But the years had left their mark on Alexander. His hair had turned gray, and faint lines etched his face, but his resolve had only grown stronger. The crowd quieted as he began to speak. The final address, When I first stood before a crowd like this, Alexander began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. I was a man trying to atone for his mistakes. I thought I could balance the scales, redeem myself, and put my past behind me. But what I've learned is that redemption isn't something you achieve. It's something you live every day. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. This foundation was born from tragedy, he continued. Kayla Davis, a vibrant, brilliant, and innocent child, was taken from us because of a system that failed her. But Kayla's story didn't end with her passing. It began a revolution. And that revolution isn't just about healthcare. It's about justice. It's about humanity. Applause rippled through the room, but Alexander held up a hand to quiet it. Kayla's father, Marcus Davis, once said something to me that I will never forget. He said, "This fight isn't about you. It's about every family who has suffered, every life that could have been saved." I carry those words with me every day, as a reminder that this work is bigger than any one of us. His gaze swept across the audience. Today, we celebrate our progress, but we also acknowledge the work that remains. Because as long as there are people who can't afford their medication, families who go bankrupt trying to save a loved one, or children who are turned away from care, our mission is not complete. A personal journey. After the summit, Alexander retreated to his office at the Foundation's headquarters. The space was filled with photos and mementos from years of advocacy. Pictures of smiling children at clinic openings, framed news articles about legislative victories, and a timeline of the Foundation's milestones. But it was the photo of Kayla on his desk that drew his attention. Her bright eyes and infectious smile were as vivid in his memory as they had been the first time he saw her picture in that fateful news article. "Still guiding me," he murmured, his voice soft. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Marcus stepped in, his presence as commanding as ever despite the passage of time. "Still working?" Marcus asked with a faint smile. "Always," Alexander replied, gesturing to the chair opposite his desk. "What brings you by?" Marcus sat, his expression thoughtful. "I was thinking about how far we've come, and how much of that is because of you." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "I wouldn't have been here without you and Denise." "Maybe," Marcus said, leaning forward. "But you've done more than just show up. You've changed lives, Alex, and not just through the clinics or the policies, through who you've become." Alexander's throat tightened. Coming from Marcus, those words meant more than any award or accolade. The next generation. One of the Foundation's most ambitious projects was a national mentorship program for young medical professionals from underserved communities. Alexander often visited these programs, speaking to students and sharing his story. One evening, during a Q and a session with a group of aspiring doctors, a young woman raised her hand. Her name was Sophia, a first-year medical student who had grown up in a neighborhood served by one of the Foundation's earliest clinics. "Dr. Vaughn," she began, her voice steady, "you've done so much to change the system. But do you ever feel like it's not enough?" The question struck Alexander deeply. He paused before answering. "Every day," he admitted. "But that's why we keep going. Because even if we can't fix everything, we can make it better for someone. And sometimes that's enough." Sophia nodded, her eyes shining with determination. "Thank you," she said. "I hope I can do the same." "You already are," Alexander replied. A farewell and a promise. As the years passed, Alexander began to think about his legacy. He knew that the fight for healthcare equity would outlive him, and he wanted to ensure that the Foundation was prepared for the challenges ahead. At a board meeting, he announced his intention to step down as director. The room fell silent, shocked by his decision. "It's time," Alexander said, his voice firm. "This movement isn't about me. It's about the people we serve and the leaders we've nurtured to carry this work forward. I'll always be here to support the Foundation, but it's time for new voices to lead. The announcement was met with mixed emotions, but ultimately, the board understood and respected his decision. Marcus, now a close friend, assured him, "You've built something that will stand the test of time." The final chapter. On the day of his retirement, Alexander returned to the first clinic he and Marcus had opened in Kayla's name. The waiting room was filled with patients, staff, and volunteers, all working together to fulfill the mission he had dedicated his life to. As he walked through the halls, he stopped in front of Kayla's portrait. A young boy sat beneath it, flipping through a book. Alexander knelt beside him. "What are you reading?" he asked. The boy held up the book. "It's about being a doctor. I want to help people, like the people here help me." Alexander smiled. "That's a wonderful dream. And you know what? You can make it come true." The boy beamed, and Alexander felt a surge of hope. Kayla's legacy wasn't just in the clinics or the policies. It was in every life she had touched, every person inspired by her story. As he stepped outside, the sun setting over the city, Alexander took a deep breath. The fight was far from over, but it was in good hands, and as long as Kayla's memory lived on, the world would continue to move toward justice. For her. For everyone. A legacy without end. Months after Dr. Alexander Vaughn stepped down from his leadership role at the Kayla Davis Foundation, he found himself adjusting to a life away from the constant rush of advocacy work. But his passion for change and the fight for healthcare justice had not diminished. It had only evolved. Alexander had spent decades immersed in the movement, and while his role had shifted, his commitment remained unwavering. One morning, sitting on the porch of a modest cottage he had purchased on the outskirts of Boston, he opened a letter from Sophia, the young medical student he had met during the mentorship program. Her words were filled with gratitude and determination. "Dr. Vaughn," the letter began, "I wanted to thank you for inspiring me to join this fight. I'm in my second year of medical school now, and I've joined the Foundation's rural outreach team during my breaks. Every time I help a patient, I think of Kayla and the legacy you've built. I hope I can make you proud." The letter brought tears to Alexander's eyes. He had often wondered if stepping back had been the right decision, but this was proof that the next generation was ready to carry the torch. A new calling. Though retired from the Foundation, Alexander found himself drawn to the idea of teaching. His decades of experience as a surgeon and advocate gave him a unique perspective, one he felt compelled to share with young doctors and activists. When Harvard Medical School invited him to lecture as part of a new program on healthcare ethics and equity, he accepted without hesitation. The first day of his class, titled Medicine and Morality, A Path Toward Equity, was packed. Students filled every seat, their eager faces reminding him of Sophia and the countless others inspired by Kayla's story. He began his lecture with a story, not about himself, but about Kayla. "She was just 10 years old," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "She had dreams, a smile that could light up a room, and a future that was taken from her. Her story isn't just a tragedy, it's a call to action, and every one of you here today has the power to answer that call." His words resonated deeply. Students approached him after class, sharing their own aspirations to change the system and asking how they could make a difference. "You start by listening," Alexander told them. "Listen to the people you serve. Their stories will guide you." The global impact. Meanwhile, the Kayla Davis Foundation had grown beyond what anyone had imagined. Under the leadership of a new team, including Marcus Davis and a board of young, dynamic activists, the foundation expanded its reach internationally. Clinics were established in underserved regions of Africa, Asia, and South America, providing care to communities that had never before seen a doctor. Alexander was invited to speak at the Foundation's first international summit, held in Cape Town, South Africa. The event brought together healthcare leaders, policymakers, and activists from around the world. Standing on the stage, looking out at the diverse crowd, Alexander felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment. "This movement began with a single story," he said. "A little girl whose life was cut short because of a system that didn't see her humanity. But today, that story has sparked a global movement. It's proof that even the smallest spark can ignite a fire that changes the world." Personal growth and reflection. Back in Boston, Alexander spent more time reflecting on his journey. He started writing a memoir, not as a way to celebrate his own achievements, but as a testament to the people who had shaped him. The book, titled Kayla's Legacy, A Doctor's Journey from Apathy to Advocacy, became an instant bestseller, praised for its honesty and humility. In the book, Alexander recounted not only his failures, but also the lessons he had learned from Marcus, Denise, and the countless patients who had shown him the true meaning of courage and resilience. He dedicated the book to Kayla, whose memory continued to guide him. "I didn't save Kayla," he wrote in the final chapter, "but she saved me. And for that, I will always be grateful." A reunion of purpose. Years later, Alexander received an invitation to the 20th anniversary of the Kayla Davis Foundation. The event, held in New York City, was a grand celebration of 2 decades of progress. Marcus and Denise were still active leaders, their grief transformed into a lifelong mission. As Alexander entered the gala, he was greeted by familiar faces and heartfelt embraces. Sophia, now a practicing physician, and a key figure in the foundation, approached him with a wide smile. "Dr. Vaughn," she said, hugging him, "I wouldn't be here without you." "You had found your way," he replied. "I just helped you see it." The evening was filled with speeches, music, and stories of lives changed. Marcus took the stage, his voice filled with pride and gratitude. "This movement has never been about one person," Marcus said. "It's about all of us, coming together to honor the memory of a little girl who believed in a brighter future. And tonight, we recommit ourselves to that vision." When it was Alexander's turn to speak, he kept his words brief but heartfelt. "I stand here tonight not as a leader or a doctor, but as someone humbled by the resilience of the human spirit. Kayla's legacy isn't just in the clinics we've built or the policies we've changed. It's in every life we touch, every heart we heal, and every step we take toward justice." The torch passed. As the gala came to an end, Alexander found himself standing alone before a mural of Kayla, her smile as radiant as ever. Marcus joined him, the 2 men sharing a moment of quiet reflection. "You did good, Alex," Marcus said, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "Kayla would be proud." Alexander nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "We all did, and we're not done." Marcus smiled. "No, we're not." A legacy without end. Alexander passed away quietly in his sleep several years later, leaving behind a world profoundly changed by his efforts. The news of his passing sparked an outpouring of tributes from around the globe. Clinics, hospitals, and advocacy groups held vigils in his honor, and his memoir became a staple in medical schools worldwide. But his true legacy lived on in the work of the Kayla Davis Foundation. Under the leadership of Marcus, Denise, Sophia, and countless others, the foundation continued to grow, its mission expanding to tackle new challenges and reach new heights. Kayla's story became a beacon of hope, taught in classrooms, shared at rallies, and memorialized in communities around the world. Her name was synonymous with compassion, justice, and the unyielding belief that every life mattered. And so, the work continued, because the fight for equity, humanity, and dignity never truly ends. And as long as there were people willing to stand up, speak out, and take action, Kayla's legacy, and Alexander's, would live on, forever.